The thing about open source is like, you have to repeat to yourself, it's like, feedback is a gift. Feedback is a gift. People are going to come in and give you crazy ideas. But like the lessons that you learn from open sourcing a piece of software you're developing yourself, putting that in the open and trying to walk the line between internal development, external development, shared roadmaps, that is a hard thing. But you improve your engineering practices by doing that. And the fun thing is to kind of see how things will evolve.
Welcome to Nerd Out at Spotify, where we bring you behind the curtain of the world's most popular audio streaming subscription service. Machine learning, open source, clouds, tabs versus spaces. We'll talk to Spotify engineers about interesting tech issues, big and small. I'm Dave Zolotusky, principal engineer at Spotify. By now, you've heard all about Backstage, the internal developer portal Spotify built to help our teams do their work more effectively. If you haven't, check out our archive. You probably also know that in 2020, we open sourced Backstage and donated it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, aka the CNCF, which is backed by the Linux Foundation. The CNCF is dedicated to fostering and sustaining an ecosystem of open source, vendor-neutral projects. If you're familiar with Kubernetes or Envoy, then you know their work. They also host the incredibly popular KubeCon CloudNativeCon conference. As a longtime member of the CNCF's Technical Oversight Committee, I know that they're doing important work, making cloud-native innovations accessible for everyone. This year, the CNCF is celebrating 10 years of this work. So I invited Chris Aniszczyk, Chief Technology Officer at the CNCF, to help explain what they actually do, how it's evolved over the years, and why it matters so much to developers everywhere. Plus, we'll get into what future projects might look like and what to expect from their largest KubeCon yet, which will be happening in London this April. But before we get into this episode, a little announcement on what we've been up to. We built a really cool new thing, Spotify Portal for Backstage. Spotify Portal is Backstage, hosted and managed for you by Spotify, making it quicker and easier than ever to get started with a Backstage developer portal of your very own. If you work somewhere that's been interested in adopting a Backstage IDP, but didn't know where to start, here's your chance. Learn how to apply for the Spotify Portal Beta at backstage.spotify.com. Okay, without further ado, here's my conversation with Chris. Hey, Chris, it's great to have you on. Can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your role at CNCF and how it's evolved over the years?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So, CNCF is now technically hitting its 10-year anniversary, which is very exciting for us. I've been there basically since day zero. I started out as kind of original general manager, executive director to bootstrap the organization and get it going, and eventually rolled over to CTO of the organization, focused mostly on the technical side. Been involved in open source for probably 25 years now, from like an early Linux contributor, as a Gen 2 maintainer back in the day, worked on a variety of different parts of the Linux stack, worked on the Eclipse IDE for those that remember old school development environments. Had my own kind of open source startup back in the day, which was all about managing large scale development environments. In particular, imagine tens of thousands of Eclipse instances that you kind of have to standardize, make sure they're all compliant, get developers up to speed quickly. So that was a fun part of my career, and then kind of got exposed to modern cloud native infrastructure when I was pretty early at Twitter, where they were moving from Ruby on Rails to a JVM stack of technology. And that's when I really got exposed to, how do you actually build and deploy services, that thousands of engineers have to do? How do you manage them? How do you manage failure? How do you scale things out? And so through that, I eventually finagled my way into an opportunity to help build a modern open source foundation around infrastructure with Kubernetes as a nexus of it. But been like open source engineer to entrepreneur to founder to now nonprofit foundation CTO.
So tell me a little bit about that last one. Like you glossed over as finagled. Tell me about that. And then I want to ask you what it means to be a modern open source foundation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, the Twitter experience, it was interesting being in an organization. I think I was there when there was about 100 or so engineers. So, not small, but not large by any means. And we were just basically trying to figure everything out. There was so much demand on the service, like constantly growing. We had to expand and build out our own data centers. This was even before the cloud was popular back then. It was still early days, but for us, it was just cheaper to go run and do our own storage, networking, et cetera. And so through that whole experience, I think in less than 5 years, I think Twitter grew to like a couple thousand engineers, scaled to 3 data centers, completely replatformed from a Ruby code base to Java Scala. We created our own, let's call it networking, stacks or proto service meshes. There's actually a project called Finagle back in the day, which kind of inspired a lot of the modern service mesh technology these days, whether it's Istio, Linkerd, etc. We open source Parquet, which is kind of a default storage format used all over, bootstrapped. At the end of the day, Twitter made its money off of ads. It was an advertising platform, social media network. Yeah. So the software was a means to an end. And so we're like, well, we can't always hire the smartest people in the world, but we could open source some of the stuff and hopefully get other people to work on it and help us and improve. And that was the case. Like we had a ton of projects that were picked up, used all over the place. So I think that kind of like opening of infrastructure and say, a lot of businesses these days, they're not infrastructure companies, right? Like, Twitter's a social media company. Spotify predominantly is a music streaming, service that I use on a daily, basis on my runs. So these companies, like software is a means to an end for you. And so open sourcing what you do and what you build the service with, it's doesn't really affect your business. You're just convincing other people to help out and improve what you're doing. And at Twitter, we saw a ton of benefit where we basically externalized and scaled our R&D department by getting other people to pitch in and help. We recruited great people through it. So it was a very like fun experience, but also like absolutely crazy because during all that like open sourcing and infrastructure, we're also like trying to build the company. Like we redid like our engineering ladder probably 3 times. We had like crazy programs where we actually swapped. I don't know if many people do this these days. It was a kind of unique thing where we literally swapped engineering leadership between 2 companies. I think it was Etsy and Twitter literally swapped like VPs of engineering just to like, hey, like learn what's going on over there. Learn it. So like there's a lot of cool, innovative things that happen, but it was a high growth type of situation. And so there's a lot of stuff we had to figure out, roll our own. And a lot of it was done pre-cloud dominance era. So it was different time, but very, very grateful experience and really proved to me that a lot of the infrastructure out there could be open, right? And could be co-developed.
Sounds like a ton of this is cloud native, but then you talk about it being on-prem, which of course is like to a lot of people an immediate, like you just contradict yourself in the same sentence.
Yeah. It's like cloud native doesn't necessarily imply cloud only. It kind of implies, we have this crazy cloud native definition that we built by committee in CNCF, but it's really principles around resilience, it's manageable, observable, whether that's like in a cloud or on-prem or an edge. It doesn't really matter. It's the software is built in a way that you allow these principles to happen. And modern infrastructure these days, like people are using usually multiple clouds, sometimes some on-prem stuff. So, edge-based, so it's a mix, right? It's very rare to have a fully homogeneous environment, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, and you say in your opinion, but I think in your role, you probably see more different companies' environments than almost anyone else. So it's probably not just your opinion.
Yeah, it's entertaining. And I think a lot of people don't have enough sympathy where if your company's been around for, let's say, more than 5 years, maybe a decade, right? You have a long established business. You've gone through probably one technical revolution at least, and you just have baggage. There's a lot of stuff. It's hard to kind of always, improve, maybe move to the latest, greatest technology, cloud, product, service. So you are in this position of always trying to optimize, your infrastructure. You're justifying, well, we got to move off of Ruby and go to Scala, or, Rust is the new hotness. Let's go move to Rust. It should be faster. I always have a lot of empathy and sympathy for folks that kind of have to deal with these situations.
Yes. Yeah. If I had a nickel for every time someone talked to me about their company wanting to move to Go and then not doing it.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about CNCF. You kind of what makes it modern?
When I was at Twitter, we were working with Apple, the original John Wilkes, and some of the board folks at Google, and it just exposed to me a lot of kind of different interesting ideas. But I was also involved with the Eclipse Foundation, which was a corporate-focused open source foundation, getting companies to work together. So a lot of these open source foundations, they were individual run, very volunteer-based. And so the whole idea with CNCF, outside of just, hey, we need an organization that's dedicated to a modern kind of infrastructure, we also wanted to support projects in a better way than just giving them a neutrally owned GitHub org or Git repo, right? So what do a lot of projects need to be successful, right? They need generally help with docs. Technical docs are always a weakness. Help with websites, help with running events, meetups, all these things that are periphery to just the software development to actually truly build a community. So that was kind of the original impetus. And now, it's 10 years and we're probably the largest open source foundation out there based on number of contributors. We've close to, I think, 300,000 contributors now with over 200 open source projects, nearly 800 member companies supporting us. So it's grown into this very interesting organization and has evolved over the years for sure. It's not like everyone just, hey, you were just a Kubernetes foundation, which maybe in the early days was true, but we've definitely, evolved. And Kubernetes evolved too. Like in the early days, like I don't think people realize like there was a lot of different orchestrators. There was Mesos, Docker Swarm, Joint had something that's like passing my mind. There was also like crazy unikernel folks.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. And so we started small of like, hey, we're all fighting, but like what are areas we could kind of work together on? One was like the container networking interface, CNI. There was a container storage interface. So we started to have portability amongst these things and interop. And that's how we began our let's lay down the interoperable infrastructure plumbing journey. And then over time, we started to expand into other things, right? Like we added our first service meshes, Linkerd, Prometheus kind of came in because people got to monitor infrastructure. Yeah. We had Argo come in for kind of modern workflow management. Backstage came in from Spotify because people need a modern developer portal and tracking how people do services, have like, scorecards for everything. So it's kind of evolved with what the community has needed as they've evolved through their cloud native journey of like, let's get the plumbing right. All right, what do we need to do now? Observe, secure, improve developer experience, et cetera. So,
yeah, that's really interesting because I was going to ask you how you look at those 10 years and that evolution. And from the way you describe it, it seems like it's a little bit of this kind of really embracing Kubernetes and then growing from there. So you look at projects as like kind of the metric for how you see those 10 years growing.
A little bit, yeah. I think there's like certain milestones where we've evolved in terms of what we defined as scope. Like originally when CNCF started, we never envisioned accepting container runtimes, for example, right? So now we host Containerd, which is from the old Docker Engine code base. We have Creo out of Red Hat and the OpenShift code base. So like we host these things now. We've also never envisioned hosting service meshes, and we have probably like 5 at least maybe in CNCF at last count. And things like Backstage and Argo probably would have not been in the original scope. But I think what's happened is as people became more successful with adopting cloud native practices and projects, they're like, well, we're good on the plumbing. Like we need some newer things, right? And we just go where our community kind of wants to go, and we kind of evolve and adapt. There's cases of open source organizations where they only had one way to do networking with Neutron, so you couldn't potentially innovate and plug in something else, where CNCF, we've allow multiple overlapping competing projects, which makes things a little confusing sometimes for end users, but that competition leads to better innovation and solutions for end users. And
creates endless jokes about the landscape. But
yeah, no, the landscape is fun. I should have, mentioned that earlier, but yeah, I still have the fun job of maintaining that. And, there's a fun story of, originally it was written in Node.js, and we rewrote it in Rust. So it's faster, better, more beautiful, of course. But yeah, no, it's a million plus hits on that thing, I think, a week. It gets a lot of traffic, surprisingly. But it serves a purpose. It's a complicated landscape. So we just are there to index and highlight what's out there.
Yep. But I mean, I think it's funny because we both get endless amounts of jokes about it. And to your point, it's the largest foundation and there's a ton of support and a ton of organizations join it. So it's like we make fun of it, but completely rely on it for all the most critical parts of our businesses.
It works, and I get pinged often of someone just saying thank you. Hey, or we use this now in our internal architecture review boards or Office CTO to kind of evaluate parts of our stack of what needs to maybe get updated, replaced. So it serves a purpose, and I'm happy to continue to maintain it and evolve it as long as people are happy with it.
To your point about how large it is, I think most people, especially people that would be listening to me, are at least familiar with CNCF. But I think there's a lot of depth to CNCF that people don't see on the surface. Like the whole relationship with the Linux Foundation, I think isn't like an immediate thing. So I wanted to at least touch on that and ask you to tell me about that.
Yeah, no. So when I joined the organization about 10 years ago, Linux Foundation it's the parent entity. So CNCF is considered a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation. And the best way to describe the Linux Foundation is, historically it was there to house, the development of Linux, basically to pay Linus, Greg KH a salary so they could work independently and not have to be at any company, because the way Linux is structured is it's a BDFL model, benevolent dictator for life. And that type of development model, people will forever claim bias. And what happened is over time, as open source became more popular in different industries and different parts of the tech stack, the LF kept getting approached to like, hey, we need open source in telco networking land, right? So there's a whole telco stack of technologies that power most telcos in the Linux Foundation called LF, networking. We host GraphQL Foundation. Recently, we took over PyTorch, the PyTorch Foundation from our Meta friends. So it's basically, it's foundation as a service where they handle the back office in terms of accounting, legal, all the pain in the butt things you need to kind of run an organization and, ensure good business practices. They handle all that stuff while you have the freedom to focus on your either vertical domain or horizontal domain, which is CNCF specifically. And they're great. They're great partners, great centralized services. So we love them. It's a big organization now. CNCF is the largest sub-foundation inside the Linux Foundation in terms of both projects, members, and contributors. So we have that little prestigious honor. So we kind of help out as much as we can.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I often have fun talking to people about like LF sub-foundations they either know or are most excited about. It. You can't say CNCF, but what else is out there? I think at Spotify, a lot of us have been talking about OpenSSF and what we can do with them.
No, it's a great, the Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF is a great one. And, it's horizontal like CNCF, where they're very much focused on security practices, tooling. We actually, CNCF, the beauty about the Linux Foundation, we kind of reuse other things. So OpenSSF has a project called Scorecards, which is kind of our security scorecards, which shows you potentially how secure your project is with a little card. It's like, oh, you don't really have many maintainers, or you don't have a way to report security disclosures, or you're not signing your binaries. So I just love this type of like cross-pollination that we get inside the Linux Foundation.
Can you say a little bit about like how these foundations are structured, like who the key players are? Who's running the show?
Yeah, so here's like kind of one of the secret sauces of the Linux Foundation is how they structure these organizations. So the way it works is you generally have individuals working on projects. There's usually some type of technical board steering committee that is usually elected through the folks that actually develop code. Then you have the monetary business budget side of the house, and those are usually member companies, organizations like a Spotify, a Meta, a Google. And what's important here is we separate out the business governance from the technical governance. So like the whole idea for most of the Linux Foundation is to build ecosystems where you have projects that are hosted in foundations. You have products that are developed by members of the foundation that produce profits that hopefully get funneled back into the projects, whether it's through the foundation, whether it's hiring maintainers. There's a variety of different ways. So it's the whole projects, products, and profits lifecycle that the LF tries to do. It's one way of sustaining open source. It's decently effective. It's not perfect, but it works pretty well to build an ecosystem from our experience.
That's a cool model. And all the LF foundations are similarly structured, just different technology. And just to clarify, like the LF foundations don't really get involved in like the technical decisions within the projects, right? So like what does technical governance mean?
Similar. It's hard because everyone's a little bit different. Generally, it could for like in the CNCF case, technical governance means like the overall technical scope of the organization, which projects get in the organization, which projects don't get in, maybe helping with reference architectures. So these technical bodies generally are there to oversee all the technical things or help maybe resolve conflicts that arise amongst projects. The projects themselves, like a Kubernetes or a Backstage and Argo, they're self-governing. And generally, the technical body, whether it's LF as a technical advisory board, CNCF as a technical oversight committee, they don't get involved in the project day-to-day stuff. They're just there to oversee, help. There has been some cases where they helped merge projects and efforts. There was this kind of famous case where, if people aren't aware, the second most popular project in CNCF in terms of contributors, unique contributors, is OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry was born out of a conflict between OpenCensus, which was a project out of Google, and OpenTracing, which was a smaller project out of CNCF, and there's some other kind of efforts in industry. And CNCF technical body, TOC, got together to try to unify these communities under one effort because it was just confusing. And so OpenTelemetry was born out of that effort.
Yeah, no, I was going to actually bring that specifically up, but I'm curious, like over the 10 years, do you have some collection of milestones like that where like CNCF, it seems like really made a difference, or like was involved in a project in a way that like really made a difference to the community?
Yeah, I would say, so OpenTelemetry is one of the famous cases. The Containerd rocket experience is another one where I think a lot of people don't realize is there was this kind of, we affectionately called it the container wars back then, but basically there was like different runtimes, there was different image specs, right? Or, there was Docker images, there's also app-C images that came out of CoreOS. And so there was a lot of confusion on the runtime front, the image front. CNCF helped orchestrate bringing in the Docker engine and Rocket, which was the other dominant runtime at the time, into CNCF. Basically say, look, no more shenanigans. Let's try to harmonize a little bit. And so, and we wanted these runtimes to be fully open source and openly governed. And so that was one kind of example. And, now you kind of look at it like Containerd just was the dominant container engine out there. When, there's specialized ones like Creo that serve a purpose, but that definitely was a huge change, in my opinion. I think the container storage interface effort also was another kind of big one that they were involved in to help standardize how storage drivers were written. That was another kind of huge mess in the industry where everyone had to rewrite hey, I got to work on Mesos, I got to work on Kubernetes, I got to work on Swarm. That was a huge, huge mess that was improved. I'm sure there's stories in service mesh land too. It's just, there's a lot of there was the service mesh interface that was created and eventually got archived because people decided to build out the Kubernetes ingress API and layer. And that's a much better, the gateway API is a much better solution.
A lot of that rings bells and brings back some sets of memories. What about kind of forward looking? If I say you're not allowed to say Gen AI, what are you most excited about in this space?
Yeah, I could maybe save little Gen AI for last. So recently, I do this thing called the open source velocity reports every 6 months. If you go to github.com/CNCF/velocity, this kind of shows you trends in projects, like how projects are growing, how large is their PR and issue over the year, how large is their unique contributor base. And through that work last time, I also did something a little bit different that I haven't fully shared with everyone. I was like, what happens if I just go track programming languages in CNCF? Like how many, TypeScript files or Rust files? And so what's been interesting over the years is obviously the amount of Rust is increasing in CNCF. Every year there's more and more. So I think, one thing that I'll put in as a prediction or maybe trend to look for is some of the lower level plumbing will probably be written in Rust over time. Right now, it's like Kubernetes hasn't really been written in Rust, but some of the service mesh folks have rewritten their data planes in Rust. So anything that's truly very performance sensitive may move to Rust. There's also a very big movement in, I would say, there's in the US government and other places in the world around promoting memory safe languages. Obviously, Rust is one, C++, less so. So I think you're going to see a little bit more Rust in CNCF over the years as one thing. I don't think you'll maybe see it in projects like Argo or Backstage, but if you're pushing packets around, stuff like that will probably be, Kubernetes control plane at a lower level, maybe down the line. We'll see.
Yeah, that's really interesting because then that makes me want to question the level of Rust support we have across CNCF, because if everything at that level is written in Rust, it needs to interact well with the CNCF layers. And I feel like CNCF has so historically been a Golang world, but we'll figure that out.
Yeah, I think we'll get there, but like it's not only us because like I recently saw there was an organization that like rewrote SQLite into Rust. I'm like, cool, nice. That must have been painful.
Yeah.
But it is a thing, right? And there are certain government regulations that are trying to push more memory safe languages. Other kind of fun things. What's funny is like I grew up in a time where like DevOps was a big thing, and everyone was like, you need to practice DevOps. It's disappeared in some way where I think platform engineering kind of has become like the new DevOps in many ways, for a lack of a better phrase. So we're having a lot of that appear in CNCF, where that topic is like one of the most popular topic areas for KubeCon in terms of submissions, sponsorships, interests. So it's very interesting how that's changed.
But is it like all the same topics under a different heading, or is platform engineering like a genuinely different category of thing?
So I think it's an evolution. I think it's like similar. So there would be something maybe like, look at something like Backstage, right? I consider Backstage a platform engineering tool. I necessarily would not consider it a DevOps tool, but there is overlap. It's just interesting how it's changed where like teams are hiring DevOps engineers or DevOps team. I don't see that much happening. People are hiring platform teams, platform engineers. Like it's this weird kind of evolution that happens in industry where it's like, these people were kind of doing similar things, had similar ideas. DevOps was always more like cultural at the end of the day. Like it was a cultural movement that happened to have like certain ideas around like tools and so on. Platform engineering, I think it's a mix of both, but yeah, it's just what we've noticed, at least from a CNCF perspective. We get pinged all the time now where people are like, hey, we're building out a platform team, or we're looking to improve developer efficiency across the org. So it's just a interesting thing, that like trend I've noticed. I'm not saying DevOps is dead, but I think platform engineering has taken over the helm of some of those original ideas that DevOps has, which was really around like efficiency. Like, let's break down the silos between developers and operations, improve things. And you can actually see like tools like Backstage could do that in many ways too. So
You mentioned Backstage a couple of times, and I'm sure on this podcast I can't not bring it up. But I think that there are two really interesting angles to talk about Backstage with you. One of them is exactly what you just brought up, like how well it fits with a bunch of these trends like platform engineering. But I think the other thing, to me, the thing that's been really unique about CNCF is the end user focus and the strength of the end user community. And maybe it's not the prototypical one, just in my head it is. Like Backstage is a great example of an end user company showing up with something and it growing. So I'm curious how you look at it and like how you look at the journey of Backstage from both those angles.
yeah, that's actually, I should have mentioned that. Like the other unique thing about CNCF is we're very much, focused on growing an end user and cultivating end user communities. Historically, I think a lot of end user companies like Spotify, like yourself, were nervous about open sourcing things, right? But there was, let's call it enlightened leadership on your end, where they're like, well, we could open this and maybe we could convince other people to help us out, make it better, or maybe they could go write plugins for stuff that we don't want to do or haven't thought of, and we'll improve it. And so it is an interesting trend of end user companies open sourcing internal tools and trying to build communities around it. Sometimes they even try to spin off companies or monetize things. A lot of people don't realize that, for example, Kafka came from LinkedIn, and LinkedIn actually spun that technology out into a company, which eventually became Confluent. So it's a very interesting thing that happens, and I think it really takes enlightening engineering leadership to support and take a risk on some of the things. And from my perspective, like Backstage now, I think is depending how you look at it, like fourth or third most popular project in CNCF in terms of unique authors and contributors. Like that's incredible in what has been a fairly short time. And if you actually look at it, I think we also, in my velocity reports, I do top 100, top 50, top 30 open source projects too. And last I checked, Backstage was in that top 100 open source project list, which is, this is all the stuff out there, like React and Nix and all the other crazy stuff. Like to have Backstage in that top 100 list is very impressive, in my opinion.
Yeah, we've been super proud and I guess humbled by all of those numbers.
Yeah. The thing about open source is like you have to repeat to yourself, it's like feedback is a gift. Feedback is a gift. Like people are going to come in and give you crazy ideas, and then you actually don't realize that like I have to change my own internal engineering practices maybe because we're getting community feedback. We have our internal needs, and how do we balance and communicate roadmaps. That is a hard thing, but you improve your engineering practices by doing that. And the fun thing is to kind of see how things will evolve with the project, right? I think every project comes to a point where it's like, all right, Kubernetes eventually went through this whole thing of like, we need to be boring, we need to be simpler. Yeah. They spun it out. People don't maybe not realize this, Kubernetes used to ship with a lot of storage drivers to handle all the different things. They eventually decided like, we're going to move that stuff out of tree, no longer in tree. And I think Backstage will probably have some of these moments, and I'm not too intimately involved in the project, but my gut feeling is healthy projects generally go through those types of things. It's like, all right, we've grown a lot, we've learned a lot. What do we need to like evolve and shape things? Do we need to redo our plugin system? Do we need to redo like the initial experience? Like just all these kind of questions.
We've had every one of those already, and that's the thing with the velocity you were talking about. Actually, that like we were so blown away by how quickly we got all this feedback and how quickly we got all those lists. Almost everything you just listed has happened at some point, and it hasn't been that much time. Actually, the other thing on that same note is CNCF has all these kind of more mature support mechanisms. Like once your product reaches some level, and the thing I keep thinking back to is stuff like certification exams. Like how did those things come together? And I guess Backstage has a new one coming now.
Yeah,
too.
So this is exciting. It's like the other thing that people don't realize is when you build an open source project, a big part of getting most of the world to adopt it is you need to have a training, that's, available online, and certifications to help ensure that folks are certified to know the project well, to like use it on a day-to-day basis in a company. It's one of the things that helps grow an ecosystem. And Backstage now has a certified Backstage associate thing, which is just to get people up to speed. So to me, it's a sign of like success in some ways. Like for open source projects, if you go to reach to a point where you have some kind of certification involved, that is like you're entering wide adoption.
No, and it's super cool that CNCF has these things, because most projects I think wouldn't think, oh, we need a certification exam, or we need this, that, or the other thing. And CNCF has all these mechanisms to come in and say like, yeah, you're big enough that you're there. So then I want to ask you about KubeCon, because I don't think we can talk about anything if we don't talk about KubeCon.
Yeah.
Tell me what you're excited about for London and for KubeCon in 2025. And then I want to make you tell me the history of KubeCon, because I find that story super awesome.
Oh, it's fun. So there's 5 KubeCons now, which is a little bit terrifying. We have KubeCon Europe coming up in London, April 1st through 4th. I just looked at the numbers. We'll probably sell out at somewhere between 14,000, 15,000 people, depending how many people were like legally allowed to fit in that building, but it's trending in a direction, which makes it the largest open source conference in Europe and probably the world, which is absolutely crazy. And then we have KubeCon North America, KubeCon China. We did a new KubeCon in India last year, doing the same, and KubeCon Japan is new this year for us. So part of being an open source organization is we kind of have to build community, build ecosystems, bring the technology to localized areas. And that's what we've done with KubeCon. It's a lot more work than people realize. It's a huge monetary undertaking. But for us, like convening people together in the same place to share what they're working on, interview them, record videos, post them online, disseminate knowledge in different geographies is a core part of what we do. And so I'm pumped about KubeCon London because it's going to be our largest event yet. The 3 themes, by the way, for folks that to kind of understand are, we have platform engineering as a big theme, observability is another one, and then obviously AI, and however you want to interpret that, because that's just kind of where the hype cycle is these days. But I'll give you a sneak preview, a keynote from Microsoft on re-envisioning the Kubernetes developer experience, which I'm pretty excited about that one.
Yep, that all sounds super cool.
Origin story is a little bit interesting. When CNCF was founded, KubeCon was originally run by a startup, a vendor. They were just trying to get people together to learn about Kubernetes, which is a very new thing. And there was an event initially in California. There was one in London, which was the first one I ended up going to. And so we kind of had a fun story of transitioning that event from being a vendor-owned to a community-owned thing. It took a little bit of, a negotiation and trying to kind of figure out like, this thing is going to be community-owned. It's going to have a program committee. It's going to have program chairs from the community. I think a lot of people don't realize is we rotate and pay honorarium to program chairs every year, and they rotate. They're from different communities, different specialties, because look, every conference is going to have a bit of bias. based on who's kind of organizing and running it. And we also made the important distinction in the early days that like CNCF staff and leadership cannot be responsible for the program in any really way, because people will be like, hey, like I'm a member. Why don't I have a keynote? I'm like, if it was my choice, I give everyone a keynote. But so we have the community actually shape the program. So it was a fun evolution of taking something that was like done by the community and vendor and eventually shaping up to be a community run and managed thing, which is wow. But it was small back then. We're talking a few hundred people. And now it's, 14, 15,000 in Europe, which is absolutely bonkers.
There's this amazing slide that used to be in like one of the CNCF overview decks of like the KubeCon size growing back when they were 2, and it was North America and Europe. And I feel like every time like Europe would be the largest conference we ever had, and then North America would be like 30% bigger. And then the next year, Europe would be the biggest. And then again, One thing I know Spotify struggled with for years is we've always wanted to give back to open source. And we never could figure out what that meant. Like we tried donating money or contributing. With Backstage, maybe we feel like we got a little bit closer. But in your position, do you have like concrete thoughts on what companies that are in this funny, like we really want to give back, but we don't know what to do, should do?
I think the way to look at it is when you say give back in some way that implies like charitable, which I'm all for it, whatever. You could treat open source as a charity, but the way I kind of look at it is like, your organization and company is using a ton of open source stuff, whether you know it or not. Your developers are using a bunch of libraries and so on. And so I think as an organization, you kind of need to look at supporting some of these things, analyze your software supply chain. You want to ensure that the stuff you're using may not go away, right? And there's many ways to give back and contribute, to stuff that you depend on, right? You depend on Linux, you may want to join the Linux Foundation, Kubernetes, Backstage, all these, Argo projects, you may want to support CNCF. You could also employ and hire maintainers, or we've actually seen companies that haven't joined CNCF, but they, employ part-time contributors to projects, which is great, even better. Sometimes I have projects that have an internal open source funds where they're like, here's $10,000 and help fund a security audit. There's many ways to contribute and sustain these kind of projects that are essentially part of your software supply chain. And, there are some interesting research studies. There's one from Harvard HBS Business School that basically tried to analyze, they call it like free riders, like open source free riders. People just use it and don't give back versus people who like use it and also give a little bit back. And they kind of basically found that the people that both use the software and give back a little bit in terms of contributing code or working with a foundation actually get more business value out of it, right? And they look at like how well the company has done. I could go send it to you. It's kind of a fun read, but I kind of want to get people out of the mindset that like supporting open source is not a charitable thing. It's like core to maintaining your software supply chain, making sure it's secure and dependable. And actually, there is actually business benefits for you. But, in my perspective, like, hey, I always love people to join CNCF. We're a blessed organization in some way, but the more support we have, the better. And, step one is you never have to be a member to use or contribute to any of the software projects. They're always freely available as a commonly permissively available good. So you're always welcome to do that. All our meetings are open too. You could join more meetings and learn or join an event, join KubeCon. Yep. Also a great way to support and contribute to the community.
Well, hey, Chris, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's been awesome.
Outside of all this CNCF open sourcey stuff, what else do you nerd out about?
I'm a very active runner. So I do a lot of nerding around like speed work. To anyone who's like a runner is probably familiar with terminologies like fartleks, loops, ladders. So that's kind of like my thing these days. I kind of want to get my, let's call it mile time back below 6 minutes per mile, which it was when I was a little bit younger. And it's possible. It just takes kind of a lot of tweaking and dedication. That's kind of things that I nerd out quite a bit about.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about the CNCF and KubeCon CloudNativeCon, visit cncf.io. There's still time to register for KubeCon London. Don't forget to hit the follow button so you don't miss an episode. If you have any questions or feedback, email us at nerdout@spotify.com. Nerd Out at Spotify is produced by Spotify's Ted Vergakis and by Seaplane Armada, who wrote our modern theme song. I'm Dave Zolotusky. Thanks for nerding out with us.